Happy Thursday. We are going live with Tana Amen. She is a New York Times bestselling author. She is a nurse. And a lot of you ask me why I'm not connecting with more nurses. So she's an amazing nurse. She's also married to Dr. Amen. She is part of the dynamic duo with a neuroscience clinic. Hi, it's so nice to connect with you.
Hi, Cynthia. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm awesome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I was just saying that earlier this week, I had a nurse on the podcast, and I wouldn't say the word criticized, but people have asked why I don't feature more nurses. And I think what it really comes down to is a lot of nurses don't like to be front and center. And so
it's interesting, right?
Yes. And so I was so thrilled when we connected. I loved your book. I love everything that you do.
Thank you.
And so I wanted to have a conversation, first to get to know you a little bit better. I know the viewers have been really excited. I got some great questions, but I'd love to hear how you went from being a nurse, but also I think for so many of us that go into nursing or go into professions where we're in a service to others, it's because we're healing ourselves in the process. And I think your story is so powerful. There were a lot of things about your story that really resonated with me. And I know it will with a lot of people that are watching and viewing. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background and, how you went from being a nurse to being an author. I think there are so many skills we learned as nurses, maybe not the business side of things, but there's so many skills as nurses that we learn that really translate into so many other aspects of, working and connection, et cetera.
Yeah, actually, I want to answer that really quickly because I actually talk to a lot of people about that, and I have a lot of nurses write to me as well. When we go into nursing, a lot of people think that all you're going to do is like clean bedpans. No, that isn't what nursing is all about. Yes, there's a lot of things you can do in the clinical setting, and that's amazing, and that's traditional. But I've actually worked as a clinical specialist for a device company for Medtronic. I'm an author. I've worked now, in medical, in mental health setting with my husband, doing lifestyle, more like along the lines of what you're doing. Teaching people about the power of lifestyle on their mental health. So there's so many things we can do as nurses, and I think we sort of get stuck in this box. So kudos to you for teaching people about that. I really like that. But my journey into nursing is interesting. I grew up with a lot of trauma. If you read my book, then you know that.
Great book.
I think the name, The Relentless Courage of a Scared Child, I think says a lot about it. I grew up with a lot of trauma, lots of drama. And I was a really sick kid. So I actually wanted to be a doctor when I was young. And so because I spent so much time around doctors, I was really sick and with no explainable reason. High fevers, constant antibiotics. I have had 10 medical surgeries. I had cancer in my 20s. But I also grew up with lots of trauma and drama, and no one ever made that connection. That when you grow up in trauma and drama and chaos, it affects your health in a very adverse way. In fact, if you said that back then, it was like, oh, it's all in your head. It's psychosomatic. Right. Yeah. And guess what? It kind of is in your head, but not in the way people think. Mm-hmm. We have this, when you grow up in trauma, I love this. Now they're actually doing a lot of studies on something called adverse childhood experiences, or ACE scores, which is really important because they've made this connection now. They now understand that when you grow up with a lot of trauma and drama, these adverse childhood experiences really do affect your health. Mm-hmm. And when they first looked at this, they thought, well, yeah, because it makes you more prone to things like addictions and accidents. Well, yes, that's true. But they actually looked at people like me who I don't have an addiction, right? I don't have those issues. And what they found is they still were at risk for very much higher risk for 7 of the 10 most common causes of death. Wow. Even if you are not an addict, if you've grown up in this environment. So I had spent so much time around doctors because of being sick for like these unexplainable reasons. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered, was, yes, I wanted to go into healing. It really drew me into this healing environment, but I didn't want to be any kind of nurse where like mental health nursing, because I think because of my own family and my own trauma with psychiatrists when I was growing up, I'm like, I don't want to deal with walkie-talkies. I know that sounds really awful to say, especially now that I'm married to a psychiatrist. It's kind of funny. But I wanted to do like trauma nursing, the other kind of trauma nursing. I wanted blood, guts, gore. I wanted them intubated, sedated. And it took me a long time in my own journey to finally be able to accept my my own story before I could really embrace other people's trauma, their emotional trauma. So that's sort of my journey into nursing. So I did level A trauma for a long time, neurosurgical ICU, where people were sedated, intubated, and I almost canceled my first date with my husband when I met him.
Really?
Yes, because I'm like, I am not going to do psychobabble. I'm not going to be psychoanalyzed. But that was more a reflection of my own pain, my own hurt, than it was anything.
Well, and it's interesting. Certainly you had some incredible traumatic events that you lived through, survived through, and you've thrived through. And there were definitely aspects of your book that reminded me of the traumas I grew up with, divorced parents, physical, emotional abuse. And when you're talking about how you were drawn to, very sick people, but people who couldn't talk to you, you were intubated and sedated. That really resonated with me because on many levels, I was an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore. And then I went into cardiology as an NP. And I used to always say the sicker, the better. I just intellectually wanted to it was like putting these puzzle pieces together. But once I became a parent, and I'm sure this happened for you too, becoming a parent for me started to kind of force me to deal with my stuff because I could try to bury it. I could try to sublimate it. But as I was seeing my children turning the age as I was when like my parents got divorced and, when some abuse started, it was definitely unearthing a lot of these things. What do you think is one of the reasons why you've been so incredibly resilient? Because we recognize, and as you stated earlier, that a lot of people that have grown up in trauma are more prone to addictions and, poor lifestyle choices. And then I think there's this other side where you almost become the perfect child. You just don't want to, I always said you almost wanted to be the invisible child. You want to cause any problems, cause any friction because it's so stressful. Your life is so stressful that it's much easier to exist in a space where you're the perfect child or you're the quiet child or the child that doesn't cause any problems.
You just said a mouthful there. So when I was little, one of the most important tasks of a child is to be able to go out and explore their world. They're supposed to feel safe enough to be able to go out and explore. There are healthy boundaries that your parents create so that you're safe enough to go out and explore. But if you don't feel safe, you won't do that. And I felt invisible. Hiding is safer. Being invisible is what's safer for me. So I'm not going to do that. But the problem is that creates a lot of issues as well, because when children don't have a voice, it leaves them way more vulnerable to predators. And that happened as well. And then I finally developed a voice, after my stepfather molested me, and when I was 12, but my voice became a weapon. It wasn't a balanced voice. It wasn't a healthy voice for a long time. That took time. So that's really interesting because I have two half sisters that didn't grow up with me. They grew up with my dad. So I grew up with my mom. So there's this nature nurture thing. And you have to wonder, what do genetics play? What part do genetics play versus what part does your environment play? Yeah. So I am much more like my mother. My mother was a 16-year-old runaway, never finished high school, lived on the streets. That was her start in life. And she worked 3 jobs just to put food on the table, but she ended up retiring a very wealthy woman. Because the woman doesn't know the meaning of the word no. She just won't accept the word no. She works so hard, and she ended up making something very valuable out of her life. Now, as a result of her start, we had a lot of trauma and drama. She was also very codependent. My uncle, who was a heroin addict, lived with us. She couldn't say no to the wrong people. There were a lot of problems there, but she was very resilient. And she had a lot of grit, and I inherited that grit from her. Now, was it modeled for me or was it genetic? I'm not exactly sure, or maybe it was both. My 2 half sisters were the opposite. So they lived with my dad, who was very much had a victim mentality, who very much was, just always the world is, woe is me. And they ended up following more that path. So addiction, I can't make anything of myself. It's not my fault. I don't know what to do. And they're still there. And so as a result, I ended up adopting my 2 nieces right before quarantine, because one of the things my husband and I often say is, you can't often change some of these people who don't want to. You can try to help, but they've got to want the help. And sometimes they don't, and sometimes you can't help that. But I feel this responsibility to help break the cycle in my family. I want to help break that cycle. And I haven't been successful with doing that with my sisters, but I do have a chance of doing it with my nieces. So that's where I feel I have this opportunity, is to break the cycle with my nieces. And my daughter, so my ACE score, you can take a quiz on your ACE score to find out what your childhood trauma was. Anything over 4 leaves you vulnerable to becoming ill or dying from 7 of the 10 most common causes of death. My ACE score is an 8 out of 10, but my daughter's is a 1. Now, my nieces, because of their start in life, we got them out of foster care. So that says a lot about how they started. Theirs is a 9. But since we've had them, their lives have changed radically. They're not sick as much anymore. They're learning a whole new way of life, and they comment on it constantly. They're like, my gosh, I never imagined that life could be like this. We just thought that was normal. I thought it was normal. Mm-hmm. So is it nurture? Is it nature? I'm not exactly sure. I think it's a little bit of both, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. But one thing they don't talk about when they talk about ACE scores and adverse childhood experiences, they don't talk about resilience. Because for all the negative things I learned about my family, all the negative modeling I had, I definitely picked up and I definitely was modeled some of that resilience. And that's what I choose to focus on.
I think that's really beautiful. And I'm so glad that not only with your daughter, but with your nieces, you're able to really invest back into your lineage. I would say so much of it's healing our lineage, because more often than not, it's been my experience when I talked to extended family members and then kind of heard more about how my parents grew up, and it explains some of their behaviors. Mm-hmm. And I think in many ways, one of the things that really contributed to my own personal resilience was I had very, very strong female role models outside of my mom. And my mom was very, very successful. But my grandmothers, my extended aunts, all very, very supportive and much, like with your nieces, I know that, and I tell them all the time how much of an impact they made on me growing up. And that's the differentiator. For many people, they don't have someone to look to, or they don't have the grit or resilience that you mentioned. Now, I'm curious, and I know, obviously you work very closely with your husband's work, which I'm very familiar with. Is there any research being done right now looking at structural changes in the brain in response to these kinds of traumas in terms of, I would imagine. And can you speak to that? Would you feel comfortable speaking to that? I'm noticing in the comments, a lot of people are saying, oh my gosh, you're saying, you're speaking my language. I completely had the same thing growing up. So definitely.
Yeah, it's not that uncommon. So it's so funny. When I wrote my book, there are a few people who left these comments. They're like, this can't be real. But 99% of the people were like, this was my life. It's not actually that common. Mine's not even that dramatic compared to the people we see. So I almost didn't write it because I'm like, this isn't even that, my life wasn't that, like, why would I even write this? Because it's not that uncommon. Mm-hmm. So to some people, it seems outrageous, but to a lot of us, it was normal for us. Mm-hmm. And yes, there's a lot of research being done. So one of the studies that was done was at the London College of Medicine. It was basically, they did a study on children who grow up in trauma, have the same brain changes as soldiers in combat. Now, I mean, think about that. Children who grow up in trauma have the same brain when they did SPECT scans as soldiers in combat. That's pretty crazy. So it really goes back to that ACE score I was talking about, those ACE scores. What ends up happening, several parts of the brain change. Mm-hmm. And there's more studies being done on that. But what happens is it affects your frontal lobes, which is your judgment center, your ability to make, good judgments. So it's the executive functioning of your brain. So it actually usually drops that. Now, it can make them hyperactive, but usually it actually negatively affects them by dropping the function of your frontal lobes. So your executive functioning isn't so good. Your amygdala, which is your fight or flight, your emergency response. So you're constantly stuck in this emergency response. Yeah. And this perfectly explains my husband and me. When we walk, I'm always looking behind me. When I was 15, not connected to my family at all, I was randomly attacked on the street walking to high school, and this guy drugged me down an alley. You never forget that. You never forget what that feels like. Now, I fought, I got away from him. But to this day, I have eyes in the back of my head. I'm always looking behind me. And he's like, walking with you is like walking with a cop. And I'm like, it's just, you never forget that feeling. Yeah. But if you grow up in trauma, those of us who grew up like that constantly have that. We're always looking behind us. Mm-hmm. It also affects your limbic system. So you're much more prone to anxiety and depression. So it gets stuck, that gets stuck on as well. Mm-hmm. But it also affects your hippocampus. So that begins to deteriorate, and now your cognitive functioning as well as your memory is affected. So people who grew up in trauma tend to have memory issues, can't remember names. So certain little things begin to happen. And so those are just 4 of the major centers that are affected, even Broca's area. So sometimes you can't articulate speech. So people don't understand. It's like, I know what I'm thinking, but I can't articulate the words. I can't find the word.
Yeah.
So all of these things begin to become affected because your stress hormones, and not to mention, that's just your brain, not to mention your immune system, because cortisol, when it's stuck on from the time you're really little, all of those stress hormones are stuck on. That negatively affects your immune system for the rest of your life, which is why I've had 10 medical surgeries and constantly on antibiotics when I was a kid. But that doesn't mean you're stuck with that. You can change your brain. That's the exciting part. You can do something to begin to reverse that. You can change it. You're not just stuck with what you have. Same thing with your immune system. I love your work because you're teaching people about their immune system, about intermittent fasting. That's one of the things I do. So I wrote a book called The Omni Diet. It's all about, and I went on that journey not to write that book. I went on that journey to heal myself. So what is the power of food and lifestyle? Because I didn't want to be sick, and I'm healthier now in my 50s than I was in my 20s. So I don't want people leaving with this message that, oh, I grew up in trauma, so poor me. No, do something about it. You have responsibility. And one of the stories in my book, and I don't want to hog the conversation, but I do want to tell, it's my favorite story in the book. It's a full circle moment. So one of my early childhood traumas, and it's when my GI issues started actually, was when my uncle was murdered in a drug deal gone wrong because of my other uncle who was a heroin addict who lived with us, who caused all sorts of problems in my life. I was terrified of him. But in my 20s, after I had cancer, after I went through wicked depression and wanted to die, after my life went totally off the rails, it wasn't life in the fast lane, it was life in oncoming traffic, and I was making lots of bad decisions. I had this full circle moment, and the person who changed it for me was my uncle, the heroin addict. He had gotten his life together, and he looked at me and he said, so how much responsibility are you willing to take for your life? And I'm like, for which part? All the trauma? For having cancer? For I was started to feel, I was feeling sorry for myself. Yeah. He said, I didn't ask you how much blame you're willing to take. I asked you how much responsibility you're willing to take, which means the ability to respond. And it was a light switch moment. He said, if you take 50% responsibility, then someone else still has the other 50% opportunity to change your life, has control of the outcome. If you take 100% responsibility, not blame, then you have 100% control over what happens to the outcome. And I was just like, I don't want anybody else having that much power over my life. It's not about blame. And it changed my life. So you have this opportunity, no matter where you came from, to take responsibility, which is just the ability to respond. You have that. It's the empowerment. And I started practicing martial arts because it really reinforced that for me.
That's really beautiful. And I have to be honest, when I read your book, for a lot of people that are commenting that have read your book, when I read your book, it started getting me thinking about a lot of things that I think we as adults, sometimes we suppress because sometimes those memories are just so painful. But I also look at it as we're survivors. And that's really critical, that we made a choice, a conscientious choice. Our lives could have been very, very different, but we dug down really deep. Now, I want to address a couple things. So you mentioned these specific areas of the brain, and I have a dog that's a rescue, and we jokingly refer to his behavior sometimes as reptile brain. So his amygdala, which is, the most primitive part of the brain that, responds to fight or flight. You're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. You got to run. You're terrified. You're moving. You're not going to digest your food. You're not going to stop to go to the bathroom or have sex or any of those things. You're just focused on that. When that overrides the prefrontal cortex that you were talking about, that's when we really struggle to be able to think clearly. We're just so stressed that we can't see beyond, the immediate, danger that we're perceiving. And I think a lot of what has been my own experience. And I am not a mental health specialist. I was an ER nurse in the inner city, and then I worked in cardiology as an NP, and then I developed my own practice. But the one thing I've come to find is that our bodies sometimes cannot differentiate being chased by a rabid animal versus the day-to-day stress. And certainly the last 14 months, living in a global pandemic, I think for a lot of people, it's unearthing things, maybe uncomfortable feelings, things they haven't processed, things they've kind of been suppressing. So definitely helpful if you are looking to get connected with a mental health professional. Some people were asking, if your score, we referenced that score before, the A score, if your numbers are really high, I'm assuming that you can go from higher numbers to lower numbers and back and forth. I'm sure there's some degree of flux, or is it a fixed number?
No, it's a fixed number. So because it's not about now, it's about what happened in your childhood. So the number is fixed. But that's why I don't want people to focus on, oh, I have an 8, my number. So I'm an overachiever. So when I got a score of 8, I'm like, some of those could have been subjective. I don't like the way they were worded. So I'm going to cut my score in half. My husband goes, you can't do that. You can't cut your score in half just because you don't like the score you got. But even if I cut it in half, it's anything over a 4 that puts you at risk. Mm-hmm. So those of us who've grown up in trauma don't really like the scores we get. And so we'll try and fudge them down. It doesn't matter. Anything over 4 is like, it's anything over a 4. And so you can't change the score you have. But what you can do is do something about it now. And that's what I really want people to focus on. So one of the reasons I love practicing martial arts is because I walked in one day. I love how empowering it is. After being attacked, I'm like, I'm not doing that again. I want to know how to fight. And I walked in and my master said to me, he's like, well, I'm going to teach you how to run really fast. And I'm like, but I don't want to run. I want to fight. Like, I'm a fighter. That's what saved my life, was fighting. Yep. And he goes, yeah, but if you're coming up against a 250-pound guy and you have an opportunity to run, you need to run. And so we were arguing about this. He goes, the other thing I'm going to teach you is how to fall safely. So pad up, we're going to fall safely and get up fast. And I'm like, but I've spent my whole life trying not to fall. Trying to accomplish things, putting on a mask, putting on a facade, not falling, trying to be perfect. I don't want to fall. Like all of a sudden the metaphor, like in my head, I was like thinking to myself, I don't want to fall. I want to learn how not to fall. He goes, yeah, that's never going to work. Like, you only lose a fight if you don't get back up. So you've got to fall safely. You've got to get back up. And I just, for some reason, it clicked in my head. I like metaphors. And I'm like, I've spent my whole life trying not to fall. And that's why I've gotten hurt. So I need to learn how to fall. It's a normal part of fighting. It's a normal part of life. And I got to get up safely and get the heck out of there. So don't stick around to get punched in the face, like, get out. And so that's really, I love martial arts just for all the life lessons it teaches you, for the empowerment. Now, if I have to hit someone, I'm going to hit them hard and then I'm going to run. But just the life lessons it really taught me. And so all the girls in my family, my nieces, my daughter, dance is optional, martial arts are not. But there's so many life lessons there. You can't change your score. You change how you move forward. So for me, that's lifestyle. It's diet. It's sleep. You got to get your sleep right. It's intermittent fasting. Mm-hmm. It's all of these things that I can do to make my life better today. It's meditation for me. So we treat people according to 4 circles. Biology, what's going on with your biology, the physical functioning of your body and your brain. So that's nutrition, things like that. Your psychology, are you listening to your mind? Like, you have to think about your thoughts. You have to discipline your mind. Your thoughts lie. They lie a lot. Learn how to talk back to them, manage them. It's like having a 2-year-old running through your house, just running amok. You don't do that. You discipline, right? So you don't want your inner child doing that either. It's your social circle, right? If you're a recovering alcoholic, you don't hang out in a bar. You hang out with people who uplift you, because people are contagious. Yeah. And it's your spiritual circle. People who have meaning and purpose in their lives, something beyond themselves, bigger than themselves, live longer. In fact, some studies show up to 11 years longer. So that's how we treat people.
No, I love that you're thinking, and this is not the traditional allopathic medicine model. We focus on symptoms, and it's really the more functional, root cause based approach.
We do functional psychiatry.
Right. And that's really critical, that differentiator, not just a medication. I think one of the things that was an impetus for leaving clinical medicine was I was just tired of writing prescriptions, because unfortunately that's really what it's become. So I'm seeing a lot of questions that are coming through. Someone asked, what form of martial arts do you practice? And I'm not sure if you have multiple or if there's one in particular.
So I have a black belt in Taekwondo that I got first, and now I'm a secondary black belt in Kempo Karate.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
that's amazing. What other questions do you have for Tana? I have lots of questions for her, but I want to make sure, because I got so many questions beforehand. People were asking, what is your personal nutritional perspective? Because, a lot of us morph and change as we get older. And I've come to find that, middle-aged women, of which I am one myself, we have to shift what we're doing, less inflammatory foods, less alcohol, if at all, really being cognizant of processed sugars, which I know are also not beneficial for brain health.
Not at all.
What is your personal kind of ideology, philosophy right now about nutrition?
So we obviously are focused on brain health, which, what's good for your brain is good for your heart, is good for your hormones, whatever. But we are always focused on brain. So, and there's different brain types. So I don't really believe that one diet fits everyone. And I also don't have a dog in the fight when it comes to vegan versus caveman. I just don't. It's not for me to tell you what your personal ideology is. It's like people fight more about food than they do religion or politics.
True.
That is not for me to determine. But if you're going to be vegan, we're going to help you do it in a healthy way. We're going to test your blood. We're going to make sure you are supplementing in the proper way. If you're going to be caveman, we want you to do it in the right way. We want you to eat grass-fed, hormone-free, antibiotic-free, and we want you to do mostly plant-based. So we want you to have smaller amounts of meat. So that's really where we come from. We're going to test you. We also want to look at your brain. If you're OCD and you go on a keto diet, it can actually cause you to obsess. It can actually cause you to overthink. So you might need some more healthy carbs, like high fiber, low glycemic carbs like greens. But if you are ADD, if you have sleepy frontal lobes, you will do better on a higher protein, higher fat diet. Less carbs. So we take the brain into account when we do this, and we're going to help you supplement. We will test your blood because we are functional medicine. So we always want to get to the root cause. So we want to make sure you're getting the right amounts of, fatty acids and the right amounts of vitamin D and all of these things that you're getting that you need to get in your food to make your brain and body function correctly. But we will tend to start off with an elimination diet, eliminating gluten, soy, dairy, definitely sugar, and processed foods. I know people are like, but that's everything in my house. I promise you it's not. I've written 8 cookbooks and over 500 recipes. It's not everything in your house. You just have to start to think differently. Just like when I practiced martial arts, I had to learn a new language. I had to learn how to make my body work differently. But it's actually really exciting and fun when you start to realize, oh my gosh, this is how people used to eat. We didn't have all this nonsense that we could just reach for. So it's just a new way of thinking.
Well, I love that you really embrace bioindividuality, because for everyone that's watching, I mean, I definitely openly share how I eat, but I always say you have to experiment. Some people are more carb tolerant than others. And by carb tolerant, I'm not talking about bread and pasta. I'm talking about some women and men need more starchy carbs to feel better, to thrive, to be able to sleep. To be able to sleep. I have very athletic teenage boys, and if I cut back on their carbs, there would probably be a revolt in my house, but they're also very athletic, and they need, and as I always say, they've earned their carbohydrates. So, eating the right kinds of carbs are certainly really critical. Someone asked about sleep. Do you feel like people that have had more trauma require more sleep? Okay.
I don't think they require more sleep. They have more trouble sleeping.
Yeah.
So they have more trouble sleeping, and your brain heals itself. It cleans itself when you sleep. And also, so for me, I've had thyroid cancer 4 times. It kept coming back. So they keep me on high dose thyroid. That can affect sleep. Hormones. Oh gosh. I'm 52 now. That changes everything. So the hormone shift will change everything. So all of these things can affect, but because of trauma, I am the most incredibly light sleeper. So I wear earplugs and I still hear if a door opens. I mean, it's crazy. My husband's like, how do you do that? He's like dead to the world. It's pretty crazy. So people who grow up in trauma have a much harder time sleeping. And that's why it's really important to get sleep right. We actually have one of our psychiatrists is a sleep specialist for that reason. And he's amazing. He actually has a sleep course because of all of this. So, this is how important it is. But I literally do everything. Blackout shades, cool room, eye mask, earplugs, supplements. I like literally don't eat before, too late before bed. Like all of these things, my sleep teas, like I literally have a checklist that I go through because that's how important it is.
No, and I agree. And I'm laughing because you and I are like sleep twins. I'm on the East Coast. I know you're on the West Coast, but it has definitely become an art form in middle life for a lot of men and women, especially women as they're transitioning from perimenopause to menopause. I always say I never appreciated sleep enough until it became like an art form to be able to get good sleep. One of the things that I recently added, and I have no affiliation with this, I just stumbled upon it, is the Apollo Neuro. And for me, doing that before bed, which for anyone who's watching, what it's trying to do is gently kind of keep you more in this parasympathetic rest and repose side of your brain. And it's a little bit of vibration on your skin. I wear it on my ankle. So it looks like I have a home monitoring device. I have to remind people, I'm like, it's not a low jack. I'm not in trouble if I leave the house. It's just easier to put it on my ankles. What are some of the strategies or techniques you will use beyond what you've already mentioned? If people are struggling with sleep, or what are some of your best tips beyond what you've already suggested, which is also very, very helpful?
So I'm a hot sleeper anyways because of my thyroid medication. But one of the things, now in my 50s, I'm even a hotter sleeper. So I have something called an ebb flow, and I don't get paid by this company. I don't sponsor them.
Yep.
Someone recommended it to me, and it's amazing. Now, it does make a little bit of white noise, and some people like that, but I don't hear it because I wear earplugs. So it makes a little bit of white noise, but it's literally, do you remember in the hospital, the cooling devices we had that ran water through them? It's a mini version of that. It runs water through a mask. And they have found, they actually did studies, if you place it on your forehead, it cools the frontal lobes. You stop thinking about so much. So it turns off the white noise in your head. And so you sleep better. But I can actually also put it behind my neck if I'm getting really hot. Oh my gosh, it just cools me right off and I can go right to sleep. So it's amazing. It's called ebb flow. EBB.
Yeah, we have an Ooler. So if anyone knows what that is, it's essentially you put it over your mattress and it keeps your bed cool. What I've come to find out is the white noise is so distracting, I can't fall asleep. So now we have this very expensive device that my husband and I laugh. We're like, both of us can't sleep when it's on, but it feels wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. We got a couple questions about thyroid medication, which I'm happy to answer. It sounds like both of us are on thyroid medication. I will briefly say that last September, my Nature thyroid was pulled off the market, and it took about 7 months to get back to a point where we had tried 5 or 6 medications. I'm now on a stable dose, but thyroid can definitely mess up your sleep. Are you comfortable sharing what you're taking right now? Okay.
So I can't take natural thyroid because I have no thyroid, and because of the cancer, they have to keep me at a very specific level and it can't fluctuate. Yeah. So if you've had cancer that's metastasized, then I'm too, I guess the word would be not fragile, but it comes back too easily. Okay. So because of that, they used to have me on Synthroid, but there's a newer version now called Tirosint. Yeah. And I take 188 micrograms of that, which is pretty high. And I used to be on 275, which was really high.
Wow.
Crazy, because they have to keep me at absolute zero. Yeah. And so my TSH. And then I also take Cytomel. So I have one of the few doctors who believes in giving T3. And so before they gave me some T3, I was only on T4. I felt like I was going to die. I'm like, just put me out to pasture. I was shaky. I was wired, tired, couldn't sleep at night, shaky during the day. It was miserable. And I finally had a doctor who put me on T3. And so did the combination, just low dose T3. And I was like Lazarus effect. Now, I'm still hyper because of all the medication. I have to be careful because it leaves me vulnerable to osteoporosis and muscle wasting. So I have to do weight-bearing exercise. So all of these things, but I feel better than I've ever felt doing all of this. It just means that because of the cancer, again, I want people to take away, believe me, I've been through thyroid hell, but I refuse to accept that my life is stuck there. It's like, what can I do? So rather than going, this is what I'm stuck with, it's like, no, what is the opportunity here? What can I do to make it better? Yeah. It just is what it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you found a situation that worked well for you. I too am on Synthroid and Cytomel because every other option, compounded, Armor, none of those things worked well for me. What's interesting, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that are watching, Cytomel is oftentimes, if you don't do the generic route, is very hard to get insurance coverage. I actually just started ordering it through Canada, through a licensed pharmacy and physician in Canada that's completely legit, because my own insurance company refused to pay for it after being on 6 or 7 medications. So
yeah, it's really sad. I mean, it's, I'm in a position where they actually told me they weren't going to pay for my Tirosint, which is like Synthroid. And I'm like, you know what? So I had to pay cash for it for a couple months. And I thought, what do people do who can't pay cash for medication? This is ridiculous. So I fought with them and got them to cover it, but that's just not fair.
Yeah. Well, we went through multiple review processes, and I finally just said, I'm not willing to go on generic anything. I want to stay on this because it's working. My labs are where they should be. But yeah, I went to pick up my medication and they wanted $600 for 1 month. And I said, nope.
It's not fair. It's crazy.
Not at all. Well, I want to be super respectful of your time, and I would love to at some point have you on the podcast. Tana's most recent book is The Relentless Courage of a Scared Child. Highly recommended. Just an amazing journey. It makes me so appreciative to know that even though you grew up in so much chaos, you turned it into such an amazing career and you're giving back to people. What is the easiest way for individuals to connect with you, to connect with your clinic and the wonderful work that you and your husband are doing? And then obviously purchasing your book on Amazon or their local retailers. Let them know the easiest way to connect with you. Obviously, you're active on Instagram as an example.
I think I'm most active on Instagram personally, and I answer my own questions most of the time. So that's easy. But if you go to amenclinics.com, if you need information, we're here to help you. If you need information on brain health, if you're struggling in any way. And yeah, Amazon, Relentless Courage of a Scared Child is probably the best place to find the book.
I am just filling in the name of the medications we were talking about. Thank you, everyone. This has been such a pleasure. And I know I mentioned this when I started the IG Live, that people have been asking why I'm not connecting with more nurses. And the honest answer is a lot of nurses don't want to be in front of the camera. And I'm so grateful, Tana, for the work that you're doing. You're an example of all the amazing things that nurses can do. And I'm so grateful that you're on this journey as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Cynthia. It was great talking to you.
Awesome.
I'll have to have you on my channel sometime, and we'll talk about what you do with intermittent fasting.
I would love that. I would love that. Have a great day, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.